Okay, so thanks for joining me today, Tanveer. So for our listeners at home, I've got Dr. Tanveer Ahmed with me. He's a psychiatrist and author. His books include Fragile Nation, The Exotic Rissole, and In Defense of Shame. And Tanveer actually works at the Bankstown Hospital where the nurses were filmed threatening potential Israeli patients and saying that they would harm them and not treat them. Now, how did that affect you as a healthcare worker when that news broke? What did it feel like when you first saw the footage?
Look, it was especially striking. Well, largely because so far many of these incidents have usually been antisocial, slightly deviant, rough types. You know, they might have graffitied a synagogue or done this or that. And whilst obviously it's still frightening and highly problematic, these were pillars of the community. You know, one of the nurses had won awards. They were both highly regarded. Yes, they were very young, but you know they would have been considered high status people within their communities. And for something so virulent and so public in their hospital uniforms. I mean, I did learn more about it within days because I have co-workers who've worked with these teenagers on a night shift, and they were kind of just killing time, trying to stay awake. So there was some sort of context to it, and they were very young. They're both in their mid-20s.
Right.
But I think that's what struck me the most, and that it did, in some ways, yes, it was a surprise to an extent, but for me, it was almost like a real spotlight of things that I'd probably seen you know, throughout much of my life. So it was almost like a real pulling back the curtain in a much more substantial way than other things that had happened, say, over the past 18 months.
Because you write about in your column that you were exposed to anti-Semitism as a child. You write, I grew up with it. As a child, visits to the mosque were often filled with clerics waxing lyrical about Jewish conspiracies to dominate the world and rid the world of Muslims. So you've experienced this casual anti-Semitism. And so were you surprised when you saw the nurses saying what they did, or were you surprised that they said it in their uniforms?
Oh, look, I think I was still surprised about the nature of their comments, especially as health workers, that they would say something, you know, they were using the term Jahannam, which is basically hell in Arabic, that I've sent them to Jahannam. So I think there was a symbolic component whether, you know, it's extremely unlikely they have actually done anything like that. That's my opinion. So I think there was a performative component to it.
Although it will have to be investigated.
Absolutely,
because he was found with morphine in his locker.
That's true. So there's a bit more going on for him. So, but the fact that they could say that in their health uniforms in an emergency department, I found that especially kind of challenging and striking. And I guess there was a part of me hoped to go like, come on, like surely something like this would open. There's such denial in such communities, and you know, really came out through, say, the Islamic terrorism phase. And I guess there was a part of me hoping, right, you can't hide from this anymore. Like this would surely open people's eyes within the community as well. I guess that was my hope. But yeah, look, absolutely, to have those comments, right, as a health worker, I know you've written about this too. I mean, Australia very much sees itself as an egalitarian society. Healthcare is at the heart of it. And if I can recount personal experience, I remember as a junior doctor, one of my first few days, I remember going into intensive care and having 3 people side by side. One was a homeless person, one was a barrister, another person was like a businessman or something like this. And it's amazing to see how they would get exactly the same care, exactly the same level of attention. And I remember thinking at the time, this is a great country. Like, this is very special, right? And so that's where I think if there is any, and to be honest, all my entire career, I don't think I've ever seen it. I've never actually seen it in practice where somebody's applying different standards. I mean, we have to, I've had to treat murderers, pedophiles, you name it, and I've never seen a health worker act any differently, regardless how objectionable a person was. Now, actually, that's not entirely true. I think pedophiles sometimes are challenging for especially some female nurses.
Okay.
But they get it together. Yeah. So I guess that's where when I saw that, I thought I sort of felt, oh, that's a real shame, because I felt like even Muslims I know who are health workers and might have very strongly anti-Israel views and possibly anti-Semitic views. So they might have all these objectionable views. I've never seen that applied in a healthcare treatment context. So I guess there was a part of me thinking, I suspect it's the same for these two. Right. I think there's a performative component. But the fact that they even voice these opinions, I think was a real shame.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, for our viewers and listeners, they might not be familiar with your work. Can you just give me a brief history of, your family's Bangladeshi? When did you come to? When did they come to Australia? What's your religious background and so on?
Yeah, sure. So born in Bangladesh. So that Bangladesh was part of India. Then it was East Pakistan. So it's a predominantly Muslim country. So born there, came to Australia when I was 6 years old. Grew up in outer metropolitan Sydney, and that was a time, when we came in the early 1980s, that was a time when more and more immigrants of a non-white variety, so people away from Australia, they used to have a white Australia policy up until the 70s, so lots of Asian immigrants coming around then. So I grew up there, schooled in Sydney, but our family was a bit different because a lot of my community were quite religious, and many of the children actually became more religious than their parents. So often they found identity in a particular type of Islamic religious identity, whereas probably our family was a bit more secular, if you could say. So I think that has partly informed my writings, that I observed certain trends around me. But we were almost, you could say, culturally Muslim, in that we might fast, we might do Ramadan, we'd go to the mosque. And then I became a doctor and became a psychiatrist. So I sort of bring it both that personal lens and the psychiatric lens. So look, you mentioned going to the mosque. So I don't think you think anything of it as a child. You think, and so even the very notion of a Jew is sort of novel, because I'd never met a Jewish person until I went to high school. So most of and I guess that's interesting, especially in Australia, but I imagine there's similarities around the world. It's a relatively small community in Australia, and they tend to exist in segregated pockets of the two biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. So I think a large portion of the population would rarely meet Jewish people, and I was similar. So when you hear these sort of sprouting of various things, and remember, I would add clerics are sprouting nonsense about lots of things.
Right.
So to some extent, you take it with a grain of salt.
Right. Yeah.
You're like, okay, I mean, they're often not. They're not always the most. You get a wide variety, and they're probably improving now. I think there's a lot better, lot stronger focus that they have to be, vaguely sane and vaguely educated. Right. But that wasn't always the case in the past. So you'd get all sort of waxing lyrical. You wouldn't necessarily take it very seriously. But remember, outside of the mosque, you'd also see it at dinner parties, etc. So you'd see your parents talking about various conspiracy theories of this, or the Jews do this. It wasn't always outright virulent, but it was more that kind of sense of possible deceit or kind of control. You definitely grew up with that sort of feeling about Jewish people. Okay.
We've published a number of articles at Quillette about anti-Semitism. Some of them are very fascinating, and they look at anti-Semitism from different angles. I wouldn't say some of them are very fascinating. They're all fascinating. Benny Morris wrote an interesting article for us about Muslim anti-Semitism, and there are those quotes from scripture about, search for the Jews to kill them if he's hiding behind a rock or a tree, and the reference to Jews as pigs and so on. So we know those that kind of those anti-Semitic passages are in scripture. But I feel like the conspiracy theories are somewhat different. I'm not sure if that really is part of traditional Muslim teachings. And a lot of what you just described now with the the vague conspiracies about control and deceit. A lot of that feels European to me.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I think the nature of Muslim Semitism has more to do with the history of anti-Semitism, partly from Christian communities.
Yeah.
So if you look throughout history, arguably Muslims got on better with Jews than Christians did for much of human history. And they've often coexisted reasonably well. And Muslims do have a special place for Jews. I mean, the reality is, the Quran borrows heavily from Torah type themes. Muslims used to face towards Jerusalem for the first kind of 150 years of its existence. So they're quite wedded to the hip, and they're seen as people of the book, like Christians.
Right.
They're monotheists. And I think Jews were, to a large extent, treated well. There are certainly verses where there's some anti-Jewish tropes. But even there, I guess Muslim scholars would probably say Muhammad, by and large, it was only in specific settings where there may have been a particular Jewish group that behaved badly or betrayed or didn't do what they were told, whatever it was, that he then acted against them. But he would rarely have spoken Jews en masse as a collective in negative terms.
Right.
I guess that's what Muslim scholars would say. And like many things, the Quran would have some verses that are positive, some verses that aren't. So I don't think the scriptural side really gives us the answers about modern Muslim anti-Semitism. And if you're really looking over the last 100 years, I think the growth in what we might call Islamism, which has huge overlaps with Islamic terrorism, I think the trends about themes around Jews, Israel, Western domination, Islamic humiliation. I think all of those things tell us more about the character of modern Muslim anti-Semitism. And some interesting trends. So let's think, 100 years ago, the Ottoman Empire crashes. Then obviously you've had these, the Arab world is in huge flux. You have World War II. And even researching this article, Claire, I didn't know that the Nazis had an Arabic service. And they used to kind of bellow out all these themes. And they were actually seen, there was a lot of sympathy for Nazis, for the Nazis throughout the Arab world. So they actually had quite a bit of influence. So it's another point of that a lot of the historical Christian anti-Semitic themes, they were deceitful, there were conspiracies, all of those things. They're from the Christian world, but the modern Muslim anti-Semitism has embraced that absorbed it, if you like. And even, I guess, a key intellectual here is the Sayyid Qutb. And, he's sort of seen as almost one of the key intellectual fathers of Islamism. And he actually does start writing about Jews in a much more negative light. That they should be seen as potential enemies. They betrayed Muhammad. There's references to Medina, which is one of the religious sites. So he incorporates that as a broader, almost as a reimagining of how Muslims should view Jews. And I think that's been very influential as well.
So Qutb is the father of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he did his writings in Egypt, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
And he has been very influential in the 20th century, influenced Osama bin Laden, for example, and various other people who have gone on to commit terrorist acts. There's a fascinating book that I read by a writer called Paul Berman on the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism, called Terror and Liberalism. And in this book, Berman argues that Qutb was actually influenced by European ideas of totalitarianism. So when Qutb observed that the Western liberalism was schizophrenic, in that in the West we don't have ideas, the government doesn't impose ideas on people of what the good life is. We have to work it out on our own. He saw that as incompatible with Islam, where you can't have the separation of church and state. To have a pious population who commit to the teachings of Islam, it has to be enforced by the state. So Berman argues that his philosophy was a reaction against the West, and it's been influencing people ever since.
Well, I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be honest, I can't remember if it was Qutb or not, but one of his formative stories he tells has a real kind of sexual allure. He was he's on a train in America or something like this, and I think like a hostess kind of bends over to serve him and kind of flashes some breast or something. And he took this as some sort of symbol of Western decay or something like he sort of, but it was, as a psychiatrist, very interesting how there's this sexual undertone to a lot of the Islamic extremism type views. But you are right that even the Nazi view, Arab nationalism, which was such a prominent force after World War II, it borrows heavily from National Socialism and some of the big trends in Europe at the time. So those sort of themes have been very influential. I guess one of the big questions around modern Muslim anti-Semitism, a lot of Muslims will say, including to this column, they'll say, hang on, no, we're not anti-Jewish, we're just anti-Israel, right? So dissecting, I guess a key element of this is dissecting, are there some deeper views about Jewish people, about Jews in general, their place in Western society, their place around the global system, if you like, that are independent of Israel, that influence anti-Semitism, whereas many Muslims will counter saying, no, it's just we hate Israel, right?
Right.
But the evidence suggests, in my opinion at least, I think the evidence suggests otherwise. And I mean, you could also argue Israel can be a front for the anti-Semitism. So in fact, there may be strong anti-Jewish views, but Israel can form a bit of a cushion to hide that as well.
Oh, absolutely. But the anti-Israel or the anti-Zionist focus is a form of Soviet anti-Semitism. So after Israel was successful in the Six-Day War, during the Cold War, I believe the Soviets were shocked and so discouraged that they turned to a strategy of demonizing Israel as a way of demonizing the West and the US in particular. So these sort of narratives of, imperial domination coming out of Israel and then, dovetailed with the Soviet, portrayal of Jewish people as being bloodthirsty. And so we're getting a lot of different trends and themes of anti-Semitism sort of coming in together, all focusing in
that's what's
Israel.
Interesting, isn't it? Because you can almost argue that modern Muslim anti-Semitism is kind of this combination of all this, as you say, European anti-Semitism, combination of Soviet, more Western Europe,
Christian, Nazi.
Yeah, and they brought it together in this modern Muslim form. Yeah. And it's heavily derivative.
Right.
And it doesn't have its roots in Islamic theology or scripture much. Not much at all. But it is interesting. It's right around that phase where Israel and Jews have taken on a different dimension. Suddenly they're seen as you say, dominators or
colonists.
Exactly. So they're suddenly,
imperialists.
I mean, I guess you could almost see, some people would argue Israel is essentially this expression of Western colonial guilt, right? It's kind of its foundation.
Yeah.
And so suddenly there it sits, in line, it's this outcrop of initially Britain and then the US within the Middle East. And that's where it's amazing to see the last 18 months, just the sheer upheaval. And arguably Australia more than most. I mean, everywhere there's been an element of upheaval. But in terms of what this Israel-Palestine challenge has caused in the last 18 months since the October 7 attacks, I can't think of too many other Western countries where there have been more institutional upheaval and individuals affected, whether it be in the arts or in politics, or, we have multiple cases that you and I are aware of. I mean, your listeners may not be, but I actually can't think, and even some of these incidents, like the nursing incident, there was the Opera House incident with the protests. It is curious that Australia possibly is almost at the peak of Western countries that have had a degree of cultural and social upheaval from the latest sort of Israel-Palestine crisis.
Do you have any theories as to why that might be?
Look, I probably would. I guess one, on one level, we should actually have a more socially cohesive group because we have skilled migration. Traditionally, we've been more effective in our multiculturals because we've had skilled migration. Now, it's worth talking about Bankstown Hospital. Now, that area of Sydney is a very interesting area, like southwestern Sydney. Most of your viewers won't be aware of it, but that's a highly multicultural ethnic area. You could almost compare it to Brick Lane a little in London, where it was often home to the most recent waves of immigrants. So half a century ago, it might have been one group. So, for example, post-Civil War, lots of Lebanese migrants came in the 70s and 80s. More recently, you're getting people from Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asian. For example, we see a lot of Rohingya refugees from that crisis. So it gets successive waves of immigrants, but they tend to be relatively, it's a lower socioeconomic area. Yeah. It tends to get lower socioeconomic groups. But given these sort of incidents of raising questions about migration, Australia effectively has one group that did poorly integrate. And they were the people who came from lower skilled, namely sort of Lebanese groups from the Civil War. And they have generally struggled a little bit more. They've been more geographically concentrated. They haven't had the same social mobility. They've got much higher statistical rates around crime and disability and welfare dependence, all of those sort of things. And they exist right in this region, right? In this Bankstown area we're talking about. But I guess it would be a controversial view, but my potential view is that many of the most heinous acts, be it when protests have got out of control or... Actually, I have been interested, more recently we've seen some of the actual people committing anti-Semitic acts identified, and many of them are not Muslims. And many of them are actually from just kind of ordinary antisocial... Right. They might be from some housing commission estate or lower socioeconomic groups. So I found that interesting. So it is possible that many of the people committing acts are people who would already like to commit criminal acts, right? Right. And are now channeling a broader tension in the public. And this happens. You see it in crime. Yeah. But that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of anti-Semitic feeling. Yeah. But it is possible that the people who end up committing the acts are doing it with much more unsophisticated drivers of their behaviour. So they're just being opportunists. Exactly. And if it was prejudice being directed towards another group, they would potentially go and scribble. That's right. If there was suddenly all this public anger about vegetarians or something, they might scribble a restaurant. They're like, I'm being facetious, but it's an observation more about some criminal behaviour. Yeah. But that's another reason where the nursing incident stands apart. Right, because it's unusual. They're not. So I've seen some of these offenders or these people who are alleged offenders on TV, and they look like, methamphetamine addicts. They don't look like they have upstanding. They're rough as guts. They're rough as guts, and you wonder if they even know Israel. I don't know, right? Well, I mean, some of the graffiti doesn't have Israel with its proper spelling. So the knowledge of what's going on must be quite low. Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about anti-Semitism from your experience as a psychiatrist, because it seems to me that a lot of people who fall into the trap of being anti-Semitic are on the conspiratorial. They're more towards the end of the spectrum when it comes to believing in conspiracy theories. And a lot of anti-Semitism really just is a conspiracy theory. This group of people rule the world, they're present in financial and media institutions, and suddenly that's cast as sinister rather than just being a byproduct of, what certain people are interested in or so on. And I'm wondering if what's your experience with people who are more towards that end on the conspiracy spectrum? We probably learned a huge amount of this through the pandemic, because there was such a burst of conspiratorial thinking, whether it's around vaccines or all sorts of other groups, anti-government things. And yes, a lot of them originate from America. But unquestionably, there's always been a set of people more likely to have paranoid style thinking. And it's a broader comment when things are really complex.
Right.
People often look for
simple
scapegoats and gives them order. It's a way of making sense of the world when they feel like they can't. But unquestionably, it's gone through the roof in an online world. So increasingly, if we increasingly see society as a bunch of autonomous individuals just linked to the internet, and large portions of them are barely physically connected to physical communities.
Yeah.
Increasingly, they are latching onto all sorts of online communities, many of them perfectly healthy. But in terms of, I mean, now you can belong now in a what seemingly non-pathological way to all these pathological types of beliefs. It could be pedophiles, it could be terrorists, it could be anti-vaccine types, and you could find thousands of people online and would feel like, quite a...
Totally normal.
Yeah, it would feel like quite a reasonable sort of group. So I think that's one key thing. I mean, the Jewish thing is interesting though, isn't it? Because if you raised it, again, if something raised at, say, a dinner party with friends of my parents, well, they would say, well, and they would often be highly educated. They'd come back and say, well, hang on, half the rich list are Jewish. They dominate Hollywood, they dominate Wall Street. And so they would say, well, part of it is based on fact.
Okay.
Right? They might try and counter that. And then obviously even recently we've had some incidents, the Australian journalist Antoinette Loutouf, who's Lebanese Australian, and a lot of that is about what influence did a so-called Jewish lobby have.
Right.
And, there's messages, there's there's campaign messages from sort of tens of a Jewish lawyer group, etc. Now, I bring that as in people who would argue Jewish conspiracy, and even international figures like, say, Mehdi Hassan, etc. Now, you and I wouldn't necessarily agree with his political views, but he's clearly a bright person. So he would say, well, hang on, some of these are actually based in fact. If 7 of the top 10 rich listers are Jewish, etc.
I think where it falls down though, like I get your point, but I think where it falls down is this idea that there's a shared agenda. So, you can find just take Australia or the United States, you can find plenty of prominent Jewish intellectuals on the left as well as on the right. And they don't necessarily share anything in common apart from their religion or their cultural background. It's just like, I'm a woman, but I don't necessarily share an agenda with Clementine Ford.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? So I think where that narrative of control and world domination, which is at the heart of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, I think where that falls down is where, people get out these charts and say, well, these people are working in media institutions, they must all have a shared agenda.
That's right, yeah. Look, I totally agree.
When often they're disagreeing with each other on very important, and have fundamentally different values. So I think that's the...
I guess some points I'd add there, like say you do have enormous cultural power in a place like Hollywood, there's still a huge skew to, say, Holocaust stories, something like that, right? So there may be a cultural influence that is often possibly disproportionate, right? For example, and I guess certainly other ethnic groups, one of the things you could argue, and this overlaps me being a psychiatrist too, is that the argument may be that level of economic and cultural power allows other types of influence, such as dominating stories of suffering.
Right.
And dominating, we live at a time where so much of political power comes from proclaiming pain. People competing over victimhood and suffering, and a lot of what I guess some other groups would say, and that's why we're getting this big debate: Islamophobia versus anti-Semitism.
It's a competition.
It's about who can dominate the suffering. But I totally agree with you in that. I've been to Israel. I mentioned in the column that I've been to Israel. Partly through your referral. It was with Rebel Media, and that was a very interesting experience. But that is very striking in Israel because it's a hugely diverse political culture.
Yeah.
You've got so many critics, all these people kind of screaming at each other. Like it's a very robust democracy. And even now there are huge critics of Netanyahu and some of his policies. So that is quite refreshing to see. And I agree with you. I don't think there's that. The shared agenda does fall down. But I mean, another interesting point to talk about here is historically anti-Semitism came from the right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas modern anti-Semitism has arguably, from a purely political point of view, has shifted to the left. And again, and you mentioned the whole shift to Soviet-style anti-Semitism. Right. It overlaps with the shift to suddenly Israel and Jews being the dominators. So suddenly Jews, Israel being figures of strength and not kind of side hustle parasites.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's seen, left-wing anti-Semitism is viewed as a form of punching up.
That's right.
Because, as you say, they're a successful minority group when it comes to education and economic outcomes. And, the left have a problem with the fact that groups and certain migrant groups have unequal outcomes because they're hesitant to accept that some cultures have different priorities than other cultures. They're even hesitant to acknowledge the role of genes, which is obviously controversial. But, I think it's easy. Well, it's like I can look at two different groups having different economic or educational outcomes and easily recognise that there's nothing sinister going on. It's just that maybe one culture has an emphasis on tiger mothering,
Yeah.
Maybe another culture, like we have this issue in Australia where our selective schools are not dominated by people who look like me, Anglo-Aussies. They're dominated by families who are the kids of families who are East Asian migrants. And it's, there's a different cultural emphasis placed on education. And that's not because there's some, it's not sinister. It's just a natural, when people are free to do what they want to do, you naturally get unequal outcomes. But it can be hard when you have these political philosophies that cannot accept that there will ever be unequal outcomes, and everyone has to have exactly the same, level of equality. It can be hard to sort of reconcile that philosophy with the reality, which is that certain groups thrive in certain conditions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And certain cultures are more suited to performing well in the modern economy.
In terms of those power dynamics, I think that's another interesting point. Like before I wrote about anti-Semitism, years ago, I've often wrote about Islamic terrorism. And one of the psychological underlay of that was often this mingling of personal humiliation, feeling that, you're being shafted in the society you lived in, you're being held down, and then that mingling with a more collective or civilizational humiliation.
Yeah.
I.e. Islamic world being kind of dominated and held down by the West, including Israel, right? So that combination is interesting. But again, that I think flows through to the Jewish conspiracy. Because if you see it in a collective way, they're like, okay, I'm being held down in a Western society because it's racist and I'm a Muslim. If I look collectively, the West is screwing over Muslims in the Middle East, and Israel is the kind of figurehead of that.
Right.
And then likewise, so what you end up getting, this is why Palestine becomes this symbolic thing. The average person doesn't know that many Palestinians, and they probably don't care that much about Palestine as a physical entity, but it becomes a psychological, psycho-spiritual type entity, right? Where for the average Muslim, and even just the average person who identifies with the left, it becomes the ultimate figure of oppression. Yeah. So even in their lives, they're like, I didn't get a promotion. I remember even hearing this when I was growing up, that my dad got screwed over at work, and he'd almost be there going, it's like, I didn't get the promotion. Look at the Palestinian bloke getting stuffed over by the Israeli tank. And they like identify with it, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Right, in a funny way. It's like Muslims getting shafted kind of everywhere.
Right.
But I guess I'm bringing back to the Jewish conspiracy.
Yeah.
How, again, it has a modern dimension. Because if Jews are seen atop of a broader Western domination holding Muslims down, then even at a day-to-day individual level, it's like, well, okay, I didn't, so-and-so, I didn't get this promotion. It's partly because, there's these Jewish shareholders or something, whatever it might be, So, they might see that in even their day-to-day life.
Right.
Well away from Israel.
Yeah, it's striking to me that this these narratives are so persistent, because to me, looking at the media coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict since October 7th, it seems ludicrous to me to suggest that Jews run the media, because there's been so much coverage of Palestinian suffering. And, and just with the weekly protests that we see in our major cities here in Australia and elsewhere, I mean, it seems to me that this narrative of control of the media is very flimsy.
No, absolutely. I mean, and again, many Jewish groups would say the exact opposite. They feel they get shafted in the media all the time. So, I mean, when both groups have that conspiracy, it's probably a sign it's being covered collectively at a reasonable level.
Right. So again, going back to your work as a psychiatrist, I want to just discuss this conspiracy thinking a little bit more. How do you bring people out of their conspiratorial beliefs when they develop?
Well, a lot of it's about belonging, isn't it? So a lot of it's ultimately we're outwardly, we'd pretend to be rational beings, but we're often, to a large extent, we're also driven by what extent we belong to a group, what are our emotional ties to a group, all those tribal entities. So usually in those sort of settings, I mean, you can give some level of rational evidence is often unreliable. It has sort of, limited appeal. It's not unlike cognitive behavioural therapy, where you really need them to show insight, not necessarily that this view is better than your view. You need to try and show them how this conspiratorial thinking is hurting them in their current life.
Right.
How it might be limiting them. Right? Has it stuffed up the relationship with their families? Is it affecting other arenas? That you almost have to think of it as addiction, right? It's a bit like addiction, where in addiction, it's not that the addiction is bad, even though it may be, to reach someone at an emotional level, you need to show the pros cons of what's called motivational interviewing. How is this actually impacting things they do care about in a negative way?
Right.
And you've got to chip away at that.
Yeah, right.
And then you've got to create new sites of belonging.
Right.
Because if they're key site of belonging, I mean, it's a classic one, we'll have lots of, say marijuana addicts, all their friends are stoners.
Yeah.
So you're like, well, okay, it's very hard to get them off the marijuana if all their friendship groups are linked to that.
Yeah.
So often getting people out of conspiracy theories is a similar type of motif. And I think, again, the rise of conspiracy theories in modern society is a broader comment on I guess the anomie, if you like, where people are less connected to traditional sites of community.
Yeah.
Be it church or schools or other religions or unions.
I think what you're saying about belonging and relationships is really important. I saw a couple of tweets by Kanye West either today or yesterday where he said, actually, I'm paraphrasing, actually on further thought, I'm not actually a Nazi. And then the follow-up tweet was much love to Adam Sandler, who is a Jewish comedian actor who apparently has been talking to Kanye.
Ah, right. Getting him out of this.
Yeah. So, having a relationship with presumably an old friend, Adam Sandler has
influenced him a little.
And is making him realise that actually his views, well, I mean, who knows what effect it is having on him, but he potentially has another he's belonging to another group through his friendship.
Well, that's right. And that probably hasn't come out of any particular new information. It's come out of an emotional tie.
Exactly.
So it's come out of a relationship. So that often has more power with changing behaviour. But as soon as you're in that direction, then you can give them tidbits of actually rational information.
Right.
So that's where it never works in conspiratorial groups. Like the vaccine skeptics.
Yeah.
You can't just show them the science.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
So you have to listen, ask questions, create a safe space for people.
Exactly, acknowledge. And remember, I mean, you more than anyone has written about this. Ultimately, you belong through ideas of the sacred and all this kind of stuff, which have got all these secular meanings now.
Right.
So there's so many new versions of the sacred, and it's forever taking new forms. That's one of the big challenges of modern life. So a lot of these conspiracy theories. So, for example, the real anti-vaccine types. And I don't want to harp on about vaccines, but they will have particular ideas about what purity, how the modern world might have changed, how science has contributed to that. So similar, all these different conspiracy groups will also have certain ideas about what is sacred in that group. And they're the sort of things that require steady unwinding at least a little. And it won't always happen in rational ways. In fact, it rarely happens in rational ways.
Yeah. There is there's some thought. I don't know if you're following the drama that's been happening with Elon Musk on Twitter, but he's sharing some anti-vax stuff at the moment, and he's said that he's going to update Grok, which is his own AI, on Twitter, because if you go and ask Grok, who is the biggest spreader of misinformation and disinformation on Twitter, Elon Musk comes up. Right? Now, I'm a fan of Elon Musk. I don't say this as someone who doesn't think that what he has achieved with Tesla and SpaceX is phenomenal. But I did read the biography of him by Walter Isaacson, and his father developed strange thoughts. So his father was a great engineer, but then later in life started to believe in witchcraft and other strange things. Can we prevent this from happening to us if it's in our genes?
I think it's more making sure, I mean, even the ideas about free expression, etc. I think it's normal that we have outcrops of non-rational thinking, right? And I think that is essential. I think we need versions of that. Help us kind of see wonder or the spiritual, the sacred. So I think that is essential. And these are, there'll be many viewers of yours that be fans of Jordan Peterson and stuff. So where he draws on people like Carl Jung, etc., always talks about archetypes and all these metaphysical themes that exist in day-to-day life, and we don't always identify them.
Yeah, right.
And they exist in our personal lives too, And so I don't think you can get rid of them. I think it's more making sure that you're able to constantly counter them in a free way.
Right.
They can exist in a harmless way.
Right, through art, appreciation.
Exactly, yeah. And they can exist in private sort of groups where it is distinctly something linked to, say, the spirituality or if it exists in that metaphysical realm.
Right.
But when it kind of, starts affecting, different outcomes.
Right.
Outcomes on health or education, etc.
Relationships.
That's when a different type of intervention might be necessary. But I don't think it's necessary to get rid of it.
Okay.
I think it's essential. I think it is
interesting.
I think it is part of us. So it always exists in some form.
So we need to lean into beneficial ways of expressing our irrational desires and thoughts and emotions, and not necessarily be so afraid of it, but just channel it in a more less harmful way.
Exactly. There's healthy forms of that. I mean, that otherwise life is also potentially quite sterile. And that, remember, even some of these things we're talking about, they're reactions to an overly rational, scientific society.
Yeah.
Where people feel like they're not getting certain needs met. Or it feels too sterile.
Right. topic for another day, Tanveer. But thank you for finishing on such a fascinating subject. And I've really appreciated talking with you today about your insights from psychiatry, but also as a person who's come to Australia from a Muslim background, and your insights into, the dynamics of what's happening in some of our communities. So thanks for joining us.